Well, Eskom has reported a record loss of over 20 billion rand for this financial year. The power utility's losses are nearly 10 times more than in the previous 12 months. Eskom's interim chairperson and acting CEO, Jabu Mabuza, says the board is committed to achieving its turnaround plan. He was speaking at a media briefing in Megawatt Park in Johannesburg. Mabuza says Eskom's debts amounts to over 400 billion rand. Struggling municipalities owe the power utility over 21 billion rand, while Soweto's electricity debt has also jumped to 18 billion rand. Government wants to stabilize the power utility. It will provide nearly 130 billion rand to Eskom over the next 3 years. For more on the headwinds facing the local economy, I'm joined in studio by Dr. Azar Jammine, the Director and Chief Economist of Econometrix. Very good evening to you, Dr. Jammine. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good evening to you.
Very, very grim prospects for the country's economic growth. So what do you make of the latest revelations?
I think they are a continuation of the path that we have been following for the past decade. It is of grave concern that we are losing jobs mainly in the formal sector, and the economy is just not growing fast enough to accommodate the huge increase in the number of new entrants into the job market. Because what caused the steepness of the rise in unemployment today was not so much job losses as the fact that nearly 500,000 people entered the job market who hadn't been in the job market before.
Yeah. I mean, the World Economic Forum predicts the manufacturing and the construction sectors will undergo a minus 3.9% decline. I mean, just which are some of the sectors that are very, very critical for the country's economy that the government should pay more attention on?
Well, they're all fairly critical, and the government has been focusing very much on agriculture, mining and manufacturing, because they're also the main sectors that drive exports. But the fact is that those are the ones that are bleeding jobs most, especially mining, and one is very concerned about are we going to manage to actually sustain those sectors decently, especially given the technological advances that are taking place that are making employment of human labor more and more redundant in many instances.
Yeah. We also have on the line the South African Federation of Trade Unions General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi. Mr. Vavi, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Globe. I mean, what would you do to turn around the country's economy?
Well, the first thing is to accept that the current economic mix that government have applied for 25 years have simply not worked to the advantage of the objectives government have stated. I mean, if anything, the economic policies that have been implemented have dismally failed the working class, the black majority, and which are finding themselves in deeper and deeper levels of unemployment. So it's time for government to go back to the drawing board and to accept that their policies are not helping the government. So I think to me and to us in SAFTU, the first thing that government must accept is that this stimulus package announced last year through the president was a damn squeeze. It was just such a small intervention that it had made no difference whatsoever. That's the first point. So the government must look at how it can get resources together, and we believe that there are resources within the economy of South Africa to launch a real stimulus package at the rate of about 500 billion rand to ensure that it can lead investment and crowd in private investment to ensure that we build in the main a human infrastructure, to build roads, to revive the railway that were abandoned after 1994 as part of this adherence to neoliberalism, to restructure education, to ensure that no kid is learning under a tree, and that all of the pit toilets are done away with, to ensure that our hospitals are centers of health and not mortuaries. And that type of a a package of stimulus can then help raise the levels of investment by the public sector and hopefully pull the private sector along to make sure that we have investment levels that will raise about 23 to 24% of the GDP. To us, that's a very urgent issue to do. And the second thing, we think that the postponed discussion about the wealth tax have to be reintroduced and put back on the table again. And we think that we need to relook at how we have reduced the corporate taxes, bearing in mind that during the apartheid era, we were sitting with a 45% at corporate taxes, which have been driven down to 28%. We think that we need to relook at that as well. So we think that we need a much more expansionary fiscal policy. We need to loosen up the monetary policies, and certainly we need to cut the interest rates drastically. We suggested a 3%, and unfortunately the Reserve Bank only reduced them by 0.5%. That is not going to make any real difference in the context of the extent of the crisis of growth in the economy. So these will be some of the issues that we think must happen.
I mean, it's, quite a myriad of red flags have been raised, and so many alarm bells sounded about this particular issue. So where do you think we went wrong, and which are some of the critical sectors that we should focus on?
In our view, way back in November 1995, when the government announced a program of privatization, and that sold the buses that used to play such an important role to network the country, that closed down the railway networks, and that commercialized the state-owned enterprises, leading to hundreds and thousands of job losses all over. And secondly, in our view, the program announced in June 1996 called the Growth and Employment Redistribution Strategy should have been abandoned, at least in the very few years when it was realized that there was no growth, there was no employment, and there was not going to be any kind of redistribution of wealth. We think that the removal of exchange controls, as well as the going about getting integrated into the world economy without a industrial policy action plan for such a long time, as well as without a growth path, was a major blunder which we're now beginning to pay very, very dearly for.
All right, Mr. Vavi, please stay on the line. We'll certainly continue with this discussion. Mr. Jammine, I'm sure you were listening to Mr. Vavi. Yeah, and at the center of it all is the stagnation of the country's economic growth. And Eskom obviously comes into the picture. And, to create jobs, the government needs to think carefully about reindustrialization. And Eskom is one of the catalysts for such a drive. But we've seen the government pumping in billions and billions of rand despite Eskom's nonsense. And do you think government should continue supporting Eskom in the rate that it is?
Well, that is the big question, because you've got two choices. One is to try and improve the operations of Eskom, get it to run more efficiently and far more cheaply than is the case right now, or than has been the case. The second option is to restructure it and to sell off parts of it. That is very unpopular with the government. So short of actually improving the efficiencies of Eskom, it has no other alternative but to keep bailing out the organization. The third...
Should it though? Should the government continue bailing out
there is a
whilst
third
it is
option.
undergoing restructuring?
Well, that is the point. But ideologically, the government is totally against any form of privatization or getting outsiders to come and have an oversight of the operations, which would lend some accountability to those in charge. The problem that we've had with all the SOEs in the last decade is that they have not been accountable to anyone. And so they've had a free rein to run into corrupt practices, to waste a lot of money, and there's been no one to actually say, no, you can't do this.
Okay. Mr. Vavi, what do you suggest should be done to Eskom? Should the government continue pumping in billions to Eskom, seeing that it is a sinking ship?
We are opening a discussion inside the structures of the Federation to ask a question if really this 59 billion rand over the next 3 years is really what is needed to save Eskom. And to ask questions as to whether we need not to look at creative ways, to look at the government employee pension funds, the private sector provident funds, and look as to whether we can still guarantee, for example, the guaranteed pensions to workers and getting them to make a contribution to invest, not only in Eskom but everywhere else, but through bonds and not any other way, through buying the bonds of the state so that the state can then use that money to provide the necessary relief to Eskom. So that's the discussion we are entering inside the Federation.
And if you could, how would you deal with the issue of unemployment in South Africa?
Well, we've got to save Eskom because I think the reason why we have this massive 3.2% decline in our GDP is thanks in the main to the rolling power cuts throughout last year and at the beginning of the year. Surely we know that if we don't do anything, and we're going to get even in worse situation than what we have. We've got to end government corruption. We've got to increase the confidence of a worker who will want to make a progressive contribution to ensure, for example, that the private sector pension provident funds and the government employees' pensions can play a role in getting government to have enough bonds to use to save the state and enterprises. But there will be no such a confidence if we continue to get the headlines of corruption and when we see no action taken against the corrupt people inside government whatsoever.
And at the center of Eskom's growth, Dr. Jammine, is corporate governance.
Yes.
And there have been arguments that there's still a lack of a corporate governance within Eskom. For instance, Mr. Jabombuza has been appointed the interim CEO. So there's so many questions are bound as to how can a chairperson assume the role of a CEO at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been asked the same thing. I mean, does it make sense to have someone like that? And clearly, the government is short of ideas of finding and is unable to find people to take over that role. And part of it is because government itself has been interfering so much. The reason why the previous CEO resigned was because he couldn't actually face trying to run the company, the utility, and yet having government telling him all the time what to do.
All right, Mr. Vavi, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. And Dr. Jammine, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. All right, that was Dr. Azar Jammine, the Director and Chief Economist of Econometrix. We'll have more news in a moment.